everyone. My name is Joanna Arellano, and while I wish I was the program director, I'm the program coordinator for the Office for Peace and Justice at the Archdiocese of Chicago. I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Father Andrew O'Connor. Father Andrew O'Connor studied art, philosophy, languages, and literature at the University of Dallas, Texas, and in Rome and Ireland, and pursued a career as a painter for 10 years before entering the seminary. He was ordained in 1996 in the Archdiocese of New York, and currently serves as the pastor of St. Mary's on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. He is also a visual artist who feels that the church and art must go together like subject and verb, more so now because of the paradigms of the sacred shift along with our lives. In 2000, he founded a nonprofit organization, Sacred Artheos, in order to collaborate with artists. His projects, like using large-scale video in liturgy, have been tried and tested in Catholic parishes from Paris, France, to Pascagoula, Mississippi. In 2005, moved by an experience on a retreat in rural Guatemala, Father Andrew created Goods of Conscience. The original goal was to preserve the traditional Mayan art of backstrap weaving. Along with preserving this art form, he wanted to provide weavers with a living wage. This initial idea grew into what Goods of Conscience has become today, an apparel line that employs Mayan Indian weavers in Guatemala and underemployed sewers in the Bronx to produce clothes that look good, feel good, and do good. Committed to the interrelated ideas of sustainability, holistic community relationships, a strong sense of identity with the product, and local production, Father Andrew developed Goods of Conscience to fulfill his vision in which a literal social fabric, he trademarked that term, connects and benefits makers of well-designed clothing. At the heart of his philosophy is his concern with individuality, that the hand of the maker is there in the artifact. Please join me in welcoming Father Andrew O'Connor. And Father, I'll be introducing our two respondents very quickly. Dr. Scott Kelley is Assistant Vice President in the Office of Mission and Values and the Assistant Professor in the Religious Studies Department at DePaul University. He teaches courses at the undergraduate and graduate level on systems thinking and systemic change. He has published works on the intersection between the values of sustainability and business strategy. He holds a master's in educational administration and a PhD in theological ethics from Loyola University. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Scott Kelley. Our second respondent, Christie Klimas. In her research, Christie Klimas brings together ecology and economics in urban and tropical settings to address questions of sustainable resource use. Due to the economic drivers underlying resource use, economic knowledge is an essential component of sustainability. Indeed, economic studies have moved to the forefront of sustainable ecosystem management, and recent research has focused on quantifying the monetary benefit of ecosystem services like pollination, water filtration, and carbon storage. From valuing tropical forests for their economic potential to qualifying the benefits of urban green space, a commonality in her research interests is working towards ecological, sustainable resource management that recognizes the role of citizen stakeholders. She is co-leading a collaborative effort with funds from Environmental Protection Agency's P3, People, Prosperity, and the Planet program. The overarching vision of this project is to train a network of capable citizen scientists qualified to adaptively manage their part of the urban landscape via soil assessment. This grant would also provide educational opportunities for undergraduates to train community members and high school students in soil testing techniques, bioremediation, or appropriate use of populated landscapes. Indeed, one of her research priorities is working with undergraduate students on projects that will give them the skills to conduct and use science throughout their careers. Please join me in welcoming Christie Klimas.
just wanted to blow up the, I don't use, I'm a Mac guy, so I don't use the, how do you make it full? Just with this? Okay. Good evening. I'm very grateful for Dr. Scott Kelley's and Dr. Bill Kavanaugh's invitation for me to speak on Sweatshops and Sacraments. And I'm giving you a picture of the library of St. Mary Grand, which is my parish on the Lower East Side. And it looks really grand, isn't it? And but the reality is that I've got a leaky roof and a horrible heating bill. And also, I work with doing this project of Goods of Conscience up in the Bronx. And so, for that reason, I was selected as somebody who would have some practical knowledge about both sweatshops and sacraments. As Joanne actually read very well an introduction about my development of a fabric called social fabric. There's just a long skirt that is, you'll notice little stripes in it that are made out of glass. That's a fabric that I developed on a retreat, as you explained, in 2005 in Guatemala. And it was there that I met a priest from Minnesota who died. His name is Father Greg Schaefer. And he put on the wall in San Lucas Toliman, which is a, let's see, I'll give you just a picture of Guatemala. I think it's important to see how pretty the country is. And, but he said, globalization should lead to communication rather than anonymity. And I took that as a rule to live by. And it was on that blackboard that he said, these are the goods of conscience of Catholic social teaching. There are 4 pillars which we enumerated. The first is the dignity of the worker. The second is, and this is Atitlan, where both the parish of San Lucas Toliman and Santiago are, founded in 1550. The second is subsidiarity, that everybody has their role to play and each has their due. The third is respect for the common good, and the fourth is conscientiously remembering the poor. But I took it also because of in the fashion industry or in the apparel industry, goods are the cloth itself. And I consciously designed a cloth that is a model of the incarnation, meaning something that's both handmade, but also something that's not made by human hands at all. And that is the yarn that's produced in Rhode Island out of glass that is heated and spat through a vacuum onto unwoven cloth and cut into yarn. I send the yarn down to Guatemala, and here you see one of my shirts is being washed there as the Sutujil Indians wash their clothing in the lake. And I love this photograph because the shirt that she's washing looks like America itself, doesn't it? This was a way of discovering Father Stan Rother, who maybe about 500 yards from where this picture is taken, was killed in 1981 by mercenaries hired by the government of Guatemala. He was very impressive to me, a nonpartisan. He wasn't necessarily left or right. He was from Oklahoma and knew cotton, knew a very practical man, knew corn, and the Indians loved him for coming up with a formula, for instance, out of the corn to feed infants, twins that were born with a woman who couldn't produce enough milk. And he saved them and helped to raise them. So I took his idea of producing a sustainable cloth and I extended it to bringing the cloth to my workshop in the Bronx. And there I am in the workshop with a very tall, beautiful model from New Zealand. It was part of the cover of American Craft magazine. And it's there that I take the cloth and then fashion it using patterns into a line of apparel. This is just a little picture of, I've got just to show you what backstrap weaving is. That part of the initial idea is that here is a place where, as you may know, that the Indians can use a time-honored art and take care of their children, can do it at home, in the context of home. And it's a type of work that can be like a parish, where work maybe needs to be centered close to the mystery of other non-material things that happen to us. This is a closer view of indigo being woven. Very soon after that, I was, here's the backstrap loom over a bag that I produce, and just a view of Guatemala, Rio Dulce, where the Tarzan films were made. And there's the Maria Elena Ramirez is a mother of 9, and she started the project there in Chicacao. If you spell it out, it looks almost like Chicago, except you've got a CO instead of a G. And so she helped to build that church through her works, and I've since collaborated with her and we send down uniforms. I included this picture to, this is a priest in New York, but he's from Indiana, and he looks somewhat like Father Stan Rother, who was there in the 1980s, and also there in the Church of Santiago Atitlan. In 2009, I was discovered by Vogue magazine, and also really as a priest, I wasn't doing anything specially in the apparel industry. I was a friend had died in a skiing accident in Austria, and one of his friends was getting married and needed some help, and she happened to be an editor of Vogue. And so Cameron Diaz said, well, you know, I only wear green clothing. And because of that, because of the paucity of green clothing, they came to my door and they said, well, this is a great story, why don't you send your clothing? And I was written up by Anna Wintour in the editorial, which is a very prized position. And then Cameron Diaz is wearing her shorts, which are just guys' shorts, actually, with darts up the back, but she just loved them. So at this point, just so that you can see, here's Atitlan. I wanted to relate it to the Eucharist. So I mentioned about the cloth, that it's both something that reflects and also made by human hands. And we remind ourselves that in the offertory that the work of human hands is what we celebrate, and we intimate by it that it is integral to the saving action of God. Work is both a curse and a blessing. In the United States, in particular, the cult of the work-saving device is synonymous with freedom from moral obligations that we owe our neighbor and the worker. The mass-produced wonder of the Philo Stewart's Oberlin kitchen stove, patented in 1834, sold more than 90,000 units and was touted for freeing the homemaker from her servants as much as from work itself. I know this sounds like a diversion from clothing, but this is a friend of mine at Yale who had done a dissertation on this. And he noted that the innovation coincided with domestic advice manuals that originated in the 1830s that found an eager audience in a swelling population of literate women. In Alexis de Tocqueville's skeptical tour of America in 1831, he coined the term individualism not to describe the maverick or the Marlboro man, but rather the pervasive tendency in American democracy to form complacent and isolated communities. De Tocqueville saw our utopian experimentation less as a virtue and more as a flaw, primarily because we settled for the exclusionary perfection that the vast expanse of our nation afforded us. To hell with everybody else works best and easiest in a moral code when everyone else is both figuratively and literally far away. There are two other aspects to our American moral relationship to work that are noting: our history with slavery and our lack of a peasantry. The historian Douglas Ambrose has pointed out that in 1750, the height of the Enlightenment, no major church in colonial America ever formally denounced the institution of slavery. By 1850, every major church in the northern United States had denounced the institution. This history suggests that we turned away from slavery because we could afford to do so, thanks to industrialization and such, and not because it was necessarily an enlightened point of view. In The Sound and the Fury, William Faulkner describes the last lingering moral tie of work to the great house. Though a legacy fueled by a racial divide, in essence, the Southern plantation harbored the medieval concept of the manor, where the Lord is bread maker and the lady is bread giver, an echo of the feudal economic system. Jason Compson, malignant and bitter, declares that in 1860, that Lincoln freed the slaves, and in 1930, Jason Compson freed the Compsons from the slaves. The Catholic Church doctrinally denounced slavery in the 17th century. The lowly parish and perhaps the odd cooperative are perhaps the only modern remnants of the old order. This is what really intrigues me, is about just the thinking about our parishes, that what's possible in a lowly parish. The word parochial derives from paraoikos, a separate house, or oikos, for a temporary dweller or a stranger. It's an economy for strangers, if you will. After the fall of Rome, the pieve, a derivation of plebes or peoples, corralled farms and families under the oversight of the local church to protect the local community from roving bands of barbarians. The parish structure, therefore, was begun or born, and therefore, by definition, a parish is a place of work as well as worship. While the 1983 Code of Canon Law effectively sidelined the medieval benefice, the profit-making apparatus of the religious institution, it still alludes to its former status. I often have to describe, well, why are you making clothing in a parish? And whereas people understand when beer is made in a monastery in Belgium, that makes sense. Or when cheese is made and sold. So it is really part of where we're understanding. Beneficio is still the term in Spanish for the coffee processing plant. And it was one of those in Guatemala that, for which I was inspired to attempt to adapt the form to a modern context. I'd like to, in the world of, within our own context of work, in the world of the startup, I mentioned to Dr. Kavanaugh that how I got my start is that I started making the Alps in my parish in the Upper West Side, and my parishioners entered me into a contest with Columbia University, the business school, and I appreciate the world of the entrepreneur, in particular because they work so hard with very little possible rewards. There's a future reward, but they're willing to give themselves completely to this endeavor. The Wall Street Journal headlined a story last year in praise of failures. Invest, they said, in people that have failed, because you're bound to get some, through all their futility, grace and insight, and certainly a profitable model. One missing factor in our work culture, though, is the presence of the peasantry. And that's why I like to keep that photograph up there. I think that lovely little kid is sort of, a Guatemalan, but they're part of an indigenous culture that is a separate caste system, is what we mean really by peasantry. J. Gatsby in F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby buys a West Egg mansion from a German brewer who offered to pay the property taxes for his neighbors for 50 years if they in turn would thatch their houses. And he wanted them to look like peasants. And what did I do with that pig? Fitzgerald comments that while we Americans are opportunists, we were never peasants, quote unquote. We countenance the excesses of the rich in order not to preclude us from the honor of committing those self-same sins. It is easier to live here as a rich person too, precisely because we do not have a peasantry. Having servants, as we know from Downton Abbey, comes with responsibility and intrigue. The lack of a peasant class does not mean that we were not from peasant classes when we came over from Europe. We were peasants by and large. On the contrary, as immigrants, with the exception of the Germans, we came to the United States without an intact governing class. In the case of the Irish, the flight of the Earls following the defeat of the Battle of Kinsale in 1601, created a peasantry still dependent upon lords and landowners, belonging to a new class of ascendant landowners with little or no affiliation to their peasants. Kirby Miller's 1988 study in the aftermath of the Great Famine in Immigrants and Exiles suggests that the devastating impact of the Great Hunger was due largely to the helplessness of the Irish peasantry and fealty to absentee landlords. The Irish expected the lords to intercede for them in their hour of need. There is, in Carbondale, New York, the University of Illinois has one of the best selection of letters of the Irish during the famine period, and they're quoted in the book by Kirby Miller. Following the Williamite confiscations of 1701, the ensuing property reforms and farming methods included introduction of the American potato, enabling the Irish population to grow from 2 million in 1701 to over 8 million persons by the time of the potato blight arrived in Europe in 1845. Excessive dependence upon the potato, combined with a systematic dispossession, led to the famine. It is likely that the case that the Church in America obversely became for a time the restoration of the traditional social order of the Irish. It is also true that the disadvantages that the Irish faced in Ireland created the advantages they enjoyed in the United States, and namely that the Irish spoke English. That brings us to sweatshops. The victims of the 1911 Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in New York were predominantly women. 123 of them, of the 146 that died, all were either Jewish or Italian. The sweatshops are the first rung of the ladder in jobs for immigrants, and were tinged with the world of slaves and peasants, and that they went often no further than that job. Like present-day sweatshops in developing countries, it is not uncommon to work and be malnourished. No English was required also meant that without English, there were little options. In combining this notion of sweatshops and sacraments, the Irish played a significant role in the process of transforming the psychology of the intractable poverty and fluidity of citizenship through the development of the parish in America. James Barnett, in The Irish Way, Becoming American in the Multi-Ethnic City, argues that the Irish found their calling in the cities as the natural gatekeepers. The America that immigrants often encountered were staffed by Irish policemen, office clerks, nurses, and teachers. He notes that in 1880, fully 80% of the indigenous children in New York City were cared for by Irish nuns. Just think about that. That's why the St. Patrick's Day parade is so popular, right? You got all the kids there that are enjoying it, who are favorable to it. While many Irish women did indeed work in the garment industry, since their options were greater as English speakers, so was their worldview. In Aaron's Daughters, Hasiah Diner notes that it was culturally acceptable for Irish women to live alone and to manage money. Their work as housekeepers exposed Irish women to the enabling lives of wealthier classes, whom they imitated. A dramatic synthesis of all these factors is the case of the new St. Vincent Ferrer on Lexington Avenue East, 66th Street, completed in 1916. Predominantly Irish working class women wanted to build a better church for the sake not of size or utility, but simply for beauty and for status. They wanted to say that they had arrived. They and the Dominican fathers had contracted Bertram Goodhue, the architect of the Episcopal Cathedral of St. John, the Divine, and St. Bartholomew's. The housekeepers were raised enough to tear down the old church and put up an icon of the Gothic revival. I wanted to sort of conclude. I'm going to go through some more slides and talk about the actual life of a parish that is working. But here's I wanted to conclude with a story about Italians in New York from Robert Orsi, who wrote a book about the parish of Madonna of 115th Street. There's a lady of Mount Carmel. In that parish, around the turn of the century, so around the same time as the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, there was the Italians were relegated by the Irish to the basement. All right, that was bad. And he goes and speaks about the worldview of the Irish, of the Italians. And in particular, there was one story about what it meant if somebody fell ill as an Italian, that they would first call for an American doctor, and the doctor would come and prescribe what American doctors do, which is lots of pills, and they say clean everything up, keep it quiet, restrict the diet. If the person didn't get better, this one example was they would call the strega, which is the sort of the witch holy healer that lived often in the building. And she would come, and the first thing she would do is she'd say, did you pay proper attention to the saints? Maybe there was a local saint, St. Lucy, Santa Lucia if you're from Sicily. And they'd say, we don't know, we'd light a candle. And then they would come in and see the sick person. And you probably know they put a bowl over the head and drop in some olive oil to see if there was molecular, a little evil eye, see if there's something in there. And he would prescribe, the strega would prescribe, medicines or herbal and food, but you would invite the family to come around. The illness, therefore, was something meant for the Italians to be related to a moral universe where everybody was there. Whereas our methods of medicine usually are so scientifically separated into the one person that needs to be healed. I thought of that as a nice metaphor for also working together and with people. Here is my workers. This is Maria Rivas and Carmen, and this is great. Here we go. And this is in the workshop, and they do the pattern making. And over the years, I've discovered how much work it takes to work with, to develop the methods for this particular fabric. here's my little drawing. I'm trying to say an empire dress, you know, high thing. I draw it in there was an old kindergarten classroom that I took over. And I think an important thing is to see that the machines are good machines, but simple ones that last for a long time. This is a Juki. You can sort of see it vaguely there. And you know, the skills don't require that many machines, although ironically t-shirts require a lot of machines. For this project I also learned to weave in order to fulfill the obligations of importing to the United States. There's a lot of regulations protecting cloth. And also in weaving I began to discover sacramentality, the mystery of the weft and the warp, and what it means for us in weaving together the bride. So here's, I did a bridal outfit. I also incorporated, this is 1970s era vintage polyester, which I kind of like. And the bride is wearing a gown, but that's symbolized. The white gown of the bride and of the alb are the two garments that are frequently mentioned in the New Testament. I also produce honey and bees. Here's my beekeeper on the roof in the Bronx. It's not, you know, the church is symbolized by the bees, and with that, I can produce, I have an easy means of getting together with the parishioners every Friday to make candles from our wax. I also have a little production of hops to produce beer for the Bronx Brewery. There's in New York City, now it's being sold at Madison Square Garden. This is Maria and Father Paraclito. Down in Chicacao we went and we bring uniforms for the children that we make. Rather than giving them secondhand clothing, we're making clothing interpreting these Mayan women and the Mayan art, the Mayan, they are given an access to the original cottons that come from their hills. And there's some boys there. The little tab here has got a little anchor for hope, and it has a little green tab that comes from Gamarellas in Rome. And they love it there for the first communion. And that's it. So thank you very much for your attention. Something I didn't mention is that I come from Chicago. I come from Wilmette, Illinois. I was born there. And my mom and dad and my aunts and uncles all went to DePaul. And I was meant to make a plug for liberal arts, is that we grew up really influenced by a lot of the teachers here at DePaul who had said, well, you have to read Sertillange, La Vie Intellectuelle, and you have to read Étienne Gison, and you had to read Thomas Aquinas. And so I feel a direct beneficiary of the liberal arts education here at DePaul, and it's made a very inventive life. And I'll close with a phrase that maybe came from a priest here, but it said, you can live life without poetry, but you can never live it well. So thank you very much.
Yes, but I also have a shirt underneath that has the DePaul logo with Nike on it. So this is a different part of the story of Sweatshops and Sacraments. I also have an undershirt underneath. I have no idea where this was made. I purchased it because it was cheap. And I'm pretty sure that I probably contributed. So I've got 3 layers of clothing here. Each has a different meaning in this. And I'm just a complicated mix of all these things. So I just wanted to be perfectly transparent with where I am as a consumer. This is a picture of Holy Family. This is J-Lo's parish, if you ever know that, Jenny from the block. So this was the block. So Father Andrew's work, I think, is so incredible to me because it provides a vision of an alternative. When we think about the sweatshop issue, it's not just protest and boycott and claiming Catholic social teaching as a contrasting optic. It's creative, it's imaginative, it's hopeful, and we don't often see that. So my journey teaching this, I started teaching business ethics in 2003. And what I would do, take a case study of corporate malfeasance. They were all corporate malfeasance, and you smash them against some ethical construct, some ethical system like Catholic social teaching. And the ethical construct was always a contrast to pass judgment on corporate practice. So this is Jim Keaty, right here, was an assistant soccer coach at St. John's University, and he resigned in the late 90s because St. John's had signed a contract with Nike, so he resigned resigned or was fired, depends on who you ask. He started this team Sweat. This has been going ever for 13 years. They focus only on Nike, only on Indonesia, and there are constant reports of how Nike has failed to do something with regard to its code of conduct. On the left is a picture of Hannah Jones. She is, Nike hired her from Greenpeace around 2005. So there's been a significant evolution, corporate evolution, that isn't a story that's not often told. They got tired of being beaten up around this. The brand that they had spent so long cultivating was now associated with sweatshops. So they said, we need to hire the best and the brightest in these issues. We need to bring them on board to help us solve these problems. And so this is Hannah Jones. And in full disclosure, my brother worked in the Sustainable Business and Innovation Unit. So I had access. I had a meeting with some of these folks at Nike. And this really gave me some insights into this. And I reflected on what I was doing in the classroom a few years earlier, and I felt quite guilty because what I was doing was, I'll keep going. What I noticed was students fell into two camps. Either they were just rabidly pro-capitalist, and this is just part of the money grubbing, and I'd like my serving, please, and that's what I'm here to do, and make no bones about it. Or just, the for-profit capitalist system is just so utterly broken that we can't live with any integrity in this. And they came in with this kind of dichotomy, and they left class with this dichotomy, and I went, there's probably not a whole lot of learning going on. So I wondered, was I teaching my students to be strategic thinkers, to see how this challenge of sweatshop is embedded in a complex organizational value chain, responding to a higher educational marketplace, 255 Catholic colleges and universities, each with a different purchasing habits and trends. All of that's embedded within a complex global system and society, multiple cultures and multiple religions, and each of these has a different nuance and a different take, and all of that is embedded on one planet that we live in, where my students getting a sense of the gravity and the complexity of this system. This is a slide from David Petraeus when he took over in Afghanistan. And this was in a New York Times op-ed piece, and the piece was about how generals were complaining about death by PowerPoint. They said, we sit through these hour-long presentations with 60 slides, and we have slides like this, and how do you make sense of this stuff? Isn't it a mess? And what David Petraeus is trying to do is map the complex systems of Afghanistan, the conditions that they have to address. And you see how all these things are interconnected and it's messy, but he's trying to map it. And the alternative is, here's a declassified slide from the Iraq invasion plan. Phase 1, you kind of get the stuff over there. Phase 2, you attack it. Complete regime destruction, post-hostilities. Phase 4, unknown. So here's a very simple slide, very easy to understand, right? But the problem is it does not adequately reflect the complex realities that we're facing. So in my mind, Sweatshops looks more like this than like this, and we have to appreciate that complexity. I also wondered, was I teaching my students to think critically about Catholic social thought, its development, its nuance? So Monsignor John A. Ryan, this was building from his dissertation in 1922, phenomenal text. was I helping my students discover that Catholic social teaching is not a simple fix. There aren't just simple principles that we can apply, but it's a complex network of thought that's interconnected. So I noticed from, Jim Keedy frequently does this. He'll take something, here's catechism on remuneration of work, should guarantee man the opportunity to provide a dignified livelihood for himself and his family. At the same time, Catholic social teaching, in the face of such widely varying situation, it is difficult for us to put forward a solution which has universal validity. Just this word family alone, I started to reflect on my time in Pohnpei, Micronesia, and like many volunteers, I had figured out solutions to all the problems within a month, my first month there. And I wondered when my colleagues who got a paycheck, the locals there got a paycheck, they would take it home, and a cousin would come over and take $50 to fix his truck, and another cousin would come over and take $100 to fix the motor on his boat, and it was gone. And to get off island to go get an education, because the educational system was broken on Pohnpei fundamentally, I always wondered, why don't parents save money for their kids to go off island? And I understood that this was one reason why, or one of the problems. Towards the end of my time there, I began to realize that relationship, money in many ways was like many other resources that they have. So when you slaughter a pig, you have to distribute it. There's no means of preserving it. When you catch a fish, we caught a 7-foot marlin, and the whole thing was cut, cooked, eaten within 4 hours. But as a result, they operate within this thick, embedded social network. So they don't worry about retirement plans because they have this thick social network. And I think of me investing in my retirement plan and how much angst there is. So family, this social construct, means different things. So when you talk about a family wage, that's a complex issue. I don't know the answer to that, but I know that we have to consider these things. A quick tour through the supply chain, how complicated they are. There's, in a sense, two established brands. Nike is a brand. It makes nothing. Nike makes nothing. It is a marketing and branding company. It contracts with supplier factories to make its goods. It's not what's called vertically integrated. There are value players who just make stuff and compete only on cost. So when I buy this white undershirt, I don't really care about the brand. I care about its, that I can buy a bunch of them at one stop in Target. But what happens is they have these codes of conduct, and they source from multiple layers of providers, and you get down to the second and third tier providers, and some of them are home workers, but this reality contradicts their code of conduct, but they have to police this. And Nike has said it's impossible for us to monitor all of our 5,000 factories every day. It's just not possible. So these are contractual relationships in the supply chain. So that gets complicated. The system is complicated. This is one of Jim Keedy's suggestions. He said after 15 years of doing this work, he eventually convinced this high school to cover up the Nike logo with the Jerusalem cross. So this is, in his mind, a way to address the sweatshop issue. Coming up in April will be a year after the collapse of the Rana Plaza in Bangladesh. 1,200 plus people were killed. This is an interesting case. The original building was 4 stories. They built 5 additional stories on top of it. People had noticed cracks in this. The whole thing collapsed. So I was wondering, were my students, deaf to this? Were they impassioned by it? Were they concerned about these things? Or was it just, one news point among many others? Pope Francis has spoken vocally after this occasion about not paying a just wage, not giving work, only because one is looking at the bottom line, at the budget of the company, seeking only profit. That is against God. DePaul University relies on the Worker Rights Consortium In one of my administrative roles, I'm chair of DePaul's Fair Business Practices Committee. So DePaul has a licensee code of conduct, which means that there are certain criteria that it uses and allows manufacturers to put the DePaul brand on it. So that's called a code of conduct. So when there are perceived discrepancies between the code of conduct and some of these reports, it goes through a committee that I chair. These reports from the Workers' Rights Consortium are constant. I get emails frequently, one probably every 2 weeks, about some stage of investigation. Many of these culminate in a positive outcome, some don't. But when you take a snapshot in time, you can have a very different understanding if you don't see it in a trajectory. I like to use this analogy of the sweatshop issue. So this is a picture of my house from Google Earth. If you scale back the furthest, to the broadest possible angle. So this is helpful if you're traveling from another solar system, right? This is also a picture of my house from the scale that's too close, right? Doesn't make a lot of sense. We have to have the right level of scale when we're thinking about these issues. So my house begins to make sense here. If you know you're from Chicago, there's Belmont, Cicero, Milwaukee, Kennedy Expressway is up there. But you can explain this. There's a concept mapping that you can do at the right level of scale. Or if I wanted to back up a little bit, this might also be helpful information. Distance from the lake, there's Arlington Heights, and here's different counties. So the sweatshop issue, if you look at it at different levels of scale, it looks quite different. I wondered if students could locate their own purchasing decision in this larger value chain. So t-shirts are made for this, sold for $50. Now that's an expensive shirt. The misconception is that there are large profit margins all along this supply chain. There's really not. There's small margins kind of along the way. And this is not just, you'd have a bunch of other bars if you divided this out, because Target and Kmart have employees and cost of overhead and rent and all that. That's not to say that there isn't an obligation for the workers, but just to understand that this is a highly developed value chain, and figuring out where to intervene in this value chain is a really important question. Sometimes I felt students just gave up trying to understand, so we sell, this is Alta Gracia, I don't know if you're familiar with that, it's a factory in the Dominican Republic. So they pay 3 times the living wage, or 3 times the minimum wage, and they're trying to position themselves in the market as the only living wage apparel maker in the industry. Nike, on the other hand, has a very interesting story about how they engage in the value chain. Nike has its own internal auditing system. It's very robust. You'll notice all these grades. You'll notice most of the factories are subpar. Their manufacturing vision is to have fewer lean, green, and equitable. They think in the long-term strategy, they need to have fewer factories that are more productive and there's more social equity. Because it's very expensive to have brands that yo-yo in and out of compliance. And what do you do if a brand is compliant one year, not compliant the next? You terminate your relationship with them. So when Jim Keating talks about here's an instance of a violation, I don't think that's any big secret to Nike. In fact, the folks that I talked to at Nike said we're very grateful for Jim Keating's work because it's another set of eyes. It's a feedback loop of information that is helpful for us. Here's Nike's code of conduct, and if you match this, you position it alongside Catholic social teaching, there's a lot of congruence. A number of things. Now, what's absent is wage, the economic issue, so we'll point that out. But many of these other things, when we look at Catholic social teaching, it's a network of principles. It's not just about wage, it's also about safety and a number of other things. This is just a kind of an economic pyramid. The flow of capital that occurs through global value chains, in a lot of ways, is a good thing. It's a necessary thing. It has to happen. So when we consume locally, I think that's part of the solution, but I don't think that's all of the solution, the sweatshop issue. We also have to figure out some of these wicked challenges. Corporations, there's a myth that corporations just hop from country to country. That's kind of a myth. They do a very robust calculation of risk because it's risky. There's a reason why there aren't a lot of businesses in Somalia. There's a reason why a lot of manufacturing is fleeing from Bangladesh because there's risk. There's political risk. There's all kinds of other risks. So they do this assessment. They invest really in a long-term manufacturing relationship. The story of Nike in 1990 is very different. Over the last 13 years, they've in the industry have been recognized for a lot of innovation. And this article says, well, maybe Apple can learn from Nike in its evolution. This is interesting. This is a study by Simon Zadek from the Harvard Business School. He says corporations go through stages of corporate responsibility. It starts with the defensive, then it turns into compliance. And then they realize that this is a management problem. This isn't just a compliance problem. And then the strategic is how they're going to think about their long-term business venture in these conditions. And then ultimately, the whole industry's got to change. And they can either be a driver of that change or they can react to what other people are doing. So Nike has tried to operate in this space as much as possible, or see itself in that light. Phil Knight was the first CEO to sign the Global Compact, the UN Global Compact. He was the first CEO to participate. So Jim Keating thinks this is a paradox. Nike and a Catholic brand are fundamentally incompatible. He says Nike runs completely counter to the ethos of Jesus' gospel. So if that's the case, well then DePaul is also a paradox. I don't come to that same conclusion when I think about this. There are dozens and dozens of scorecards. Not all companies are the same. Abercrombie & Fitch, you see on this rating, is pretty poor, and you've got other ones right here that are pretty good. So when you think about the corporate venture, it's not one monolithic thing. So I started to take a little bit of a different approach. I wanted to put this in context, into a dynamic context, and an evolution of thought. So they should be attentive, intelligent, reasonable, responsible, and effective. So this is Bernard Lonergan's work. See, Judge, Act. You might be familiar with that, the Catholic Social Action. Just one concluding thought: the solutions to wicked problems are difficult to find, and they need more people thinking about them, thinking in systems to intervene effectively. I just want to conclude with one quote here from Emmanuel Levinas, I think that for me captures the complexity of the issue. I don't know how to draw the solution to insoluble problems. It is still sleeping in the bottom of a box. But a box over which persons who have drawn close to each other keep watch. I have no idea other than the idea of the idea that one should have. I have the idea of a possibility in which the impossible may be sleeping. And I'll conclude with, this is the Catholic Campaign for Clothing with a Conscience. It's a conversation that's just starting. And the goal is to raise awareness that how we engage in the creation and consumption of clothing can really be a part of our Catholic identity. And we need to start this conversation and raise attention to it, draw attention to it. This is the mission statement that we have right now. The idea is to raise awareness that promotes solidarity between consumers of clothing and the people who produce them. And the idea, we're borrowing from the St. Francis Pledge, if you're familiar with the Catholic Climate Covenant. Pray, learn, assess, act, advocate. If we do these things, I'm fairly confident that we will find some solutions to this wicked problem. Thank you.
Okay, so my talk is related. I was somewhat surprised to be asked to come present on Clothing with a Conscience, or to present my research in a talk titled Clothing with a Conscience, in part because my research is not about clothing. So that's the first difference between my talk, and yet I'll give you some context to show how my work is related, even though it deals not with clothing, but with coffee. So this is a choice experiment that we conducted at DePaul with another investigator and a student. And for me, from an ecological context, this does what a lot of my research does, where you look at people, prosperity, and the planet, and how they fit together. Coffee is a fantastic example. It's one of the most differentiated commodities in the world. It's also second only to petroleum in global demand. So it's important. We use a lot of it. The US is one of the #1 consumers. And it has the potential to be done sustainably, to give a living wage to the people who produce it, and it has high profit margins. So it can be economically viable, ecologically sustainable, and a good option for people to produce. It also potentially has a lot of problems. Elena, who's one of my students in my fair trade course, is currently doing a case study on coffee, and she could tell you about all the difficulties in coffee, including some of the political problems. I won't get into that. In addition, this people, prosperity, and the planet context ties in really well with the 7 themes of Catholic social teaching. And I come from a scientific background, so for me, here you can see that ecosystem transformations can happen in a very short time. This is the Atlantic forest on the east coast of Brazil. And from 1945 to 1990, over 90% of that forest was lost. So this is not only an amazing ecosystem transformation, but it happened in a very, very short period of time. And this area is not unique. So when we look at, this is the state that I do some of my tropical research in, it's the state of Acre, Brazil, and it has all these competing land uses. So it has 85% is still old growth rainforest. But it also has road development. This road was recently paved. It's now a transoceanic highway that goes all the way to the coastal city of Peru for transport of commodities. It has agriculture. It has urbanization. And it has burning. In fact, sometimes the burning is so severe that the airport closes because they can't fly planes. Lights never go off. And this is also a really bad time for people. The incidence of asthma is exacerbated this time. Hospitals are packed with the elderly and the very young because of the byproducts of the burning. So, looking at this in an ecological context, we can ask the question, what is the future of tropical forests? You could ask this for any ecosystem. It doesn't have to be tropical forests. But how does the environment fit in? And when we look at the drivers, they're all economic in nature. So how do we provide sustenance and living wage and opportunities for the people who work there? And how can we make these two fit? Now, I'll talk predominantly about agriculture, although there are many economic drivers of deforestation. In the literature, when we talk about this, it tends to be, historically it's been this debate of we should have parks, and we should make those parks first, and then we should not allow people in them. Versus we should address poverty first, and once we address global poverty, we'll work on the environment. And neither of those approaches alone work. Protected areas are good. They protect large areas. They get funding. But oftentimes they ignore people living in or near forests, and this is problematic. So in Guatemala's Petén region, they created a large protected area, and they moved people out who had been in those areas. And the people did what you would expect people who were very upset to be moved off their land did. They went in and they set fires. They pretty much said, if we can't have this forest that we view, that has historically been ours, then no one can. So protected areas themselves are not a universal way to, universal solution. And sometimes they're protected, but that's on paper only, where you still have people going in and using those areas. So protecting areas without taking into account how to work with the people is only a partial solution, if any. And then there's, saying, well, we're going to deal with people first and focus on poverty alleviation, potentially at the expense of natural resources. And what we find, there's a great 2009 paper on this, but the poor are most dependent on resources. So by focusing on the poor and using resources, you're actually doing development at the expense of the poor. So both of these are poor solutions, and they found in this 2009 paper that when you urbanized these areas, that the poor initially did better, but long term they went back to even poorer than they were, and they didn't have the safety net of the forest that they could go back to. So normally the benefits flow to the richest from these. And where I work is sort of the juncture between these two, where you say, well, let's let communities manage their own resources. Let's try to find a way where it's not perfect preservation, but there's a way to tie people and the planet together in a way that's ecologically sustainable and economically viable. And this requires partnerships. This is obviously harder than either of the other two options. So it's harder than just blocking people from the forest. And it's harder than just development because it requires a lot of what you've seen already, which are wicked problems, complicated situations. And so there's all sorts of ways that we can do this. My research that I won't talk about, there's rubber tapping in the Brazilian Amazon, there's tropical species that are important for timber, for non-timber forest products. Brazil nuts are an example. And we see that even with some of these options, communities are moving more and more toward cattle ranching. Part of that is subsidies for cattle ranching, and part of that is just they can't make a living wage off some of these forest products. So when we look at how can we conserve natural resources and improve the quality of life for forest residents, we can look at things like paying a price premium for eco-friendly and socially friendly goods, or responsible partnerships. And I say this in my fair trade class, I feel like this should be the norm. But what we're talking about is the exception. And that's the context for the work I did. The work I did here actually was a demand-based survey at DePaul to see what people wanted in terms of their commodities. So this is a survey that I sent out, and I call it What We Say versus What We Do, comparing what people say they're willing to pay for shade-grown coffee with what they actually pay when presented with that choice. Shade-grown coffee incorporates some of the environmental benefits that I talked about. Shade-grown coffee is grown under a forest canopy as opposed to sun coffee, which is grown in plantations here after removing the forest cover. Yields are about 30% higher in sun-grown coffee farms than in shade-grown plantations, but in the shade-grown plantations you maintain biodiversity, you maintain water filtration, and you normally have a diverse mix of species, so they tend to be better for the people who produce them, especially because coffee goes through cycles of high and low periods, like a lot of plants. So one year they have high production, another year they have low production. In addition, coffee is one of the most volatile commodities on the market, where you can get very high prices and then very low prices. So if you're a small farmer and you've invested in sun coffee, you have no alternative when prices go south. But part of growing shade-grown coffee depends on a willingness to pay a price premium for some of these environmental attributes. So what we did was we did a survey. We sent this survey to 10,000 individuals at DePaul, and we asked them whether they would be willing to pay a 5, 10, or 15% price premium for shade-grown coffee. And then, since we know that people oftentimes say that they'll be willing to pay more than they actually do, we sent them vouchers to test and see whether they did what they said they would do. Based on 1,003 survey results, we set a price at a 10% price premium because approximately 77% or 75% of people said that they would be willing to pay either a 5 or 10% price premium. And we sold shade-grown coffee alongside what Chartwell's normally served. Now, this is where we ran into, this is where we'll see some interesting results because Chartwell's actually serves fair trade coffee. So fair trade coffee and shade-grown coffee are both very good and have, shade-grown coffee is eco-friendly. Fair trade coffee can be both eco-friendly and socially just. We didn't tell people that they were selling fair trade coffee, we just assumed that they would think it was sun-grown coffee. So some of the people who changed their mind, which I'll talk about later, may have known the difference. So once individuals filled out this survey, they got vouchers for a free bakery item with the purchase of coffee, and then we could track what they did and compare it to what they said they would do. We had 1,003 surveys that were received and usable, 191. They filled out the majority of the questions and we used for further analysis. About 10% of people who answered the survey actually redeemed their vouchers, which is expected, but lower than we had hoped for. So we had 95 valid vouchers to compare. People said, over 70% of people said that they would buy shade-grown coffee at a 5, 10, and 15% price premium. And in aggregate, that's exactly what we saw. 75% of people actually, when they went to a coffee shop, bought shade-grown coffee. What's interesting about this is we expected that people would overstate their willingness to pay. They did. They also understated their willingness to pay. So here you can see these are people who said that they would purchase shade-grown coffee, and of those, only 82% of them actually did. These are people who said that they wouldn't, of which only 66% of them actually did. So those 3 people actually said that they wouldn't and did. So they're balancing out the people who said that they would and didn't. And you can see this on both ends. So here people said that they would and didn't, and here people said that they wouldn't and did. Does that make sense? So when we take these survey results and we extrapolate them back to the 1,003 surveys, so the entire DePaul population who answered the survey, we found that 77% of people were more likely than not to actually purchase shade-grown coffee, which is really good. So while people didn't do what they said that they would do, I think that this is very optimistic in terms of people wanting options that are more socially and ecologically responsible. So this was much higher than I expected. This is a very low price premium. People were paying under $1. And while I think it would be great, I thought about just modifying all my data and saying that I'd worked with clothing. I'm kidding, I would never do that. That would be morally reprehensible in a situation like this. But I think that this does indicate that people are looking for alternatives to current production. And while this is with coffee, I think that you find the same thing with clothing. And, while we didn't study this, the tradition of the university may indicate that individuals are willing to go further than purchasing, which I think is a really important part of what people have talked about tonight, to work for solutions that involve people and the planet. So I think that people as consumers is a poor representation of people. We're more than consumers, and I think that our ability to engage in these kinds of relationships is potentially the most important and most interesting result of all the talks we've seen so far tonight.
giving our speakers another round of applause. So at this time, we will now field questions from the audience. 3 things. If you could please come up to the mic so that everyone can hear your question. Also, if you could please be brief so that other people have a chance to ask their question. And if you could refrain from sharing a story or having a long comment and really just ask questions. There'll be some time afterwards to chat with the presenters. So, do we have anyone?
Although if you would clarify a point, I've been a long-time student of how successful the monasteries in the medieval times were. The figure I had quoted one time was that they had like about 45% of the gross European product came out of monasteries. You said a date when it was in canon law changed when parishes couldn't make money, is that right? Do you remember that point, or am I getting it right? Because it's such a significant idea of what your whole provocative idea of parishes being a place of work and prayer.
Thank you for that question. It's the recent 1983. It's just the recent 1983 canon law effectively sidelined the benefice system. I think in that particular law, the reason why I brought it up was twofold. One was just simply to note that canon law is, in the minds of the church, they thought that predominantly parishes wouldn't receive production or profit really from production. They thought that was a thing of the past. And so mentioning it, though, means that they know that it exists. That's a good thing, one. The second thing was that the canon law refers to property issues, which is an important part of the contemporary church, that they don't want to alienate church property, what is church property, etc. So those particular laws refer to that too. I think that as far as my understanding of canon law, and also reviewing my own particular experiment with bishops, my own bishop, Cardinal Dolan, and his predecessor, Cardinal Egan, they're fine with it, actually. They find that it's took a long time, I think that's a good part of going slowly, is that they're able to sort of sniff it out and say, I think this is a good thing. The parishioners like it, so that's positive. Up in the Bronx, they do a lot of other parish work there. Like, they need linens and things that had been done by like altar societies had often done that work, but now we've got a working place to do it. So I'm thinking it's got a future full of hope, if you will. I do think, and it can be acceptable canonically.
Other questions?
Father Andrew, I wonder if you would say a little bit more about the connection between what you're doing and sacramental life. You kind of made some comments about that in your talk, but I wonder if you could kind of draw that out for us a little bit more explicitly.
Thank you. So maybe we could start with confession. Right? They have all the sacraments, I guess we teach, basically require both matter and form, right? So if you're going to go to confession, the matter is actually confessing sins. In terms of, that you have to have something to talk about, something to work with, something material. And sometimes people come and they don't have anything on my mind. I say, well, I kind of need your help with that. Just something. So in terms of the life of the church and working together is kind of that something that in the sacramental life of the church where we're going to be transformed, we as a people need to bring something to the table. And I think part of that mystery happens in work. You know, St. Benedict says, ora et labora. And I think I mentioned to an example of, maybe it was to Scott, how something holy happens when you're working together. I went on a Jesuit, or was visiting the Jesuit mission in Ecuador called Muchachos Trabajadores. And what they do is they take the shoeshine boys and they give them an education and training, etc. But you have a lot of Americans that go down to Ecuador to do it. And I had some high school students from a Jesuit school in the San Francisco area come down. And these were kids in the afternoon. They were supposed to go divide between like a metal shop or sewing, etc. Well, I know how to sew. So I said, there were some kids and they didn't have anything to do, maybe about 5 or 6 of them. I said, you come and sew, all right? We're gonna go up there and sew in the sewing shop. Well, they were all boys, and going into the context of the sewing shop where it was all women, they were surprised that the boys were showing up. But so I didn't alert to the boys, but we just sort of sat around, and we've got curtains that we have to sew, something simple, little loops onto curtains. So I taught them how to put the needle through the thread, and some boys it was kind of tough, but other ones actually handled it pretty well. And once they started sewing and got used to what they were doing, they forgot that they were doing it, and they began to just have conversation. It was great. It was like looking outside and seeing the weather, and I thought, this is the sacramental transformation that I think happens when you work together. It's something about freeing yourself from overly, some part of your consciousness needs to be liberated. Maybe my brother flies a plane and he says, it's hard to fly a plane when you need to be helpfully distracted. Is that right? Listening to some music, and then you fly the plane better. That's always the case, but anyway, but I hope, maybe I'm speaking about it too metaphorically, but I do really think that when we make candles on Fridays, I don't have to announce what a pain it is that you got to put it in the bulletin, and but people actually just come, families, the kids can play some games if they're not interested in it. You got the kids who, I've made the best candle. There's a little bit of a competition that they have. They learn about the bee, and that smells good. They forget the world of being on the little devices, and it's a wonderful, something's happening by which we're being transformed as a parish. Does it have to happen in a workshop? Does it have to happen, maybe it's just, having a bake sale? I think that's true, but there's something about the regular call to work that is part of, they feel like, I'm doing my part, little as it is, in building up the parish.
Scott, you spoke about your students coming in the past to your class, or say starting their education, and some come in kind of anti-capitalist, some come in pro-capitalist, and the frustration is at the end of the class or at the end of the program they go out anti-capitalist or pro-capitalist. I mean, ideally, what would you have them come out thinking?
I think part of it is knowing a little bit more about the content. So there is a content minimum. But I think the goal of learning is for people to discover their own experience of learning, to know what it is they're doing when they're thinking. So it's making the thought process more transparent to them. So my dissertation was on Bernard Lonergan, and this was his primary argument that there's a lot of science envy in a lot of different disciplines. In economics, they call it physics envy. And in his estimation, the reason why science has been so successful is because they don't squabble over method anymore. Scientific method has been, it's a commonly held standard. This is the riverbed through which the flow of insight happens. So I think, to me, that that's really foundational in terms of learning. It's not a mastery of content, but it's being more aware of what responsible systems thinking is, what it looks like, how it operates.
So Christie, you talked about the awareness that is growing, not only in fair trade coffee, having that conscious choice, but also in other areas. So what do you attribute that growing awareness to?
So I think that part of it is technology allows us to better see connections that for a long time have been invisible. But there's also a movement, I mean, there are plenty of people who are going to places where our products are being made. So you have news, you have people who care going to different places and coming up with alternatives. But if you look at the millennial generation, they care about a lot of these issues. So millennials are one of the first generations. They don't want cars. I mean, cars are sort of the iconic symbol of American culture. And you have millennials that are going a very long time. You know, they have no desire to get cars. And, you know, I think that for multiple reasons, a lot of, you know, conviction and concern about other people, even in a global economy, is coming to a nexus, and this is a really good time for alternatives, really moving on alternatives. So I think that there are plenty of people who care very deeply about labor issues and different causes, and they care about them in the US, but due to a surge of information, they care about them wherever they happen.
Follow up a little bit on what you were talking about earlier. I've got to tell you, Anna Wintour, to see that in Vogue magazine, that was really cool. That's a big deal. Two questions. One is, how replicable is your model? How many other parishes are doing it all over the world? Is this really more of a developing country model, or can we do it anywhere? For example, all students are working with churches on the south side and community centers to grow crops, as small as that might be. But you have such an unusual background. Is it because of your particular interest, or are there other pastors who can do what you do? Because to get in Vogue magazine, you can't be that with a big deal.
I had the Lord to promote the whole thing. He just sent. That certainly is something that I'm considering, like just how can it be replicated? And I think you alluded a little bit to the relationship with Scott Kelley's brother Tom, who's at Nike, and they were so kind to they invited me out to Nike to talk about the issue of, well, how do you make something like this grow? To preface that, I'd have to say that when I first came up with my idea of just sort of making something in the parish, I think I did mention that my own parishioners entered me into a contest at Columbia University and at the business school. What they noted was, it's their take on it was, it's an untapped resource from an entrepreneurial point of view, all the available space in parishes. Catholic parishes have wonderful existing infrastructure. There's a physical infrastructure, but you also have people infrastructure, if you will, the amount of the connections that are possible with 20,000 parishes. The marketing issue of making, of course, as I've gone into the business, I'm trying to emulating. I'm trying to design something that's specific to that particular cloth. I've thought about it in different ways. Obviously, any parish can I could certainly, if there was a creative person, I've been approached by parishes in South Carolina and North Carolina that have a lot of that background, as well as the Nike Corporation suggesting that I go through the University of Notre Dame, and that it still is, I guess, a possibility. I can't scale it up as I am right now, but producing T-shirts and polo shirts within parishes in the United States, if the product is sufficiently, if it's there that the consumer understands why, $95 to $120 is a good price for a T-shirt. So that in terms of that scalability, that's what I think that it would have to cost. So that's very expensive, and because it's the labor and the materials times 2.2 often, and then that's your wholesale cost times 2 is your retail cost, and University of Notre Dame raises it even higher because they can do that. So to pay a living wage here in the United States would cost a lot. So how do you do it? It can't be just any other T-shirt, and I do think that it'd be nice for you to sort of see, touch some of the cotton. The cotton grows in different colors. It's very unique, and that would be a reason to buy it. It can be sourced out. So is the product going to be interesting enough to sustain that cost? The flip side of it is that if there's enough of a production, the cost may go down, and it may, it might be like, it's like economic or like fusion or something. The capital cost of setting up a workshop in a parish is comparatively low. I think it could be under $5,000. You could set up a shop in a parish. That's not much, including having workman's comp. I'm going to a high end of the. I don't know if you know it works at the scales of a fish. If you charge a little for something, you can't go down the line and charge more for it. The customer won't get it. If you've got a product that's valued a lot, that increases its worth. You don't bring it down. You can always run in danger of not being viable if you charge too little for something. For right now, I'm gaining steam, if you will, with a high-end product, and I think it can be translated. You can see Scott was good in his jacket. He's good, and it's you can move around. It's practical as well. So I'm always thinking about those issues. Does it really express our identity? Just in my own design issue, it can be produced in any number of parishes, and the parish priest doesn't have to be the designer. So that's channels of distribution. That means where you're going to sell it. I'd like to see it actually happen within parishes, so that when you charge a retail cost, that's something that's being realized by a parish, and so it would be a vertically integrated model. But in terms of the overall scale, that would take some time to develop that. But parishes can produce all sorts of things, from tomato sauce, delicious tomato sauce, to bicycles. I think that would be a really interesting. The farm is a good one. I've just seen so many different possibilities with production, and it's maybe that's something that in your studies, Christine, I thought that was interesting. Your points about it. Consumers are interested in it. I think that's the basic idea, and it doesn't have to be, as Scott Kelley mentioned, about a sense of always boycott, but we have an ingeniousness that can be tapped into. So thank you.
Scott, thanks for your talk and bringing up the complexities of the issue. My fear is that people will hear that and say, oh, yeah, well, it's complicated, and what can you do? It's complicated. I mean, how would you respond to somebody who says, one of the reasons it's so complex is because it's deliberately designed that way. It's not just a kind of fact of nature like a tornado or an earthquake or whatever, but it's deliberately designed to be complex in some ways. Companies, in some respects, are not vertically integrated by choice. They outsource things as a way of kind of washing their hands of accountability in that way. I mean, isn't the complexity something that is designed and not just sort of a fact that we have to deal with? I mean, it isn't the very problem, the fact that we don't have personal relationships and that things have been kind of put at a distance. So how would you respond to that?
I think the notion, we were talking about this earlier, there's something very attractive about vertical integration. There's, from a management perspective, from a risk assessment perspective, there are a whole lot of reasons for a company to be vertically integrated. And by that, I mean they control every phase of the value chain. The reason why Nike did this, in their estimation, they saw that there was a relative wage difference between countries. And Phil Knight wrote his master's thesis on outsourcing. This was the fundamental logic of it. So this was a business case. And I think from a business case, it makes a whole lot of sense, but 15 years on, 20 years on from that, I'm not sure that it's problematic in its entirety. I think there's been a flow of capital and goods. I think there has been a development of management capacity in many countries. So there, I think, there's some good that comes out of not being vertically integrated. And for Nike to focus on its core competencies, which is marketing and branding in the US, and then to have production be in another part. But whether that's a strategy, a business strategy, or a good moral strategy is one question. I think the other question is, in our global economy, there's going to be a point where not everything is vertically integrated. So how do we think about this from a cabinet perspective? It's like walking into a Dunkin' Donuts and saying, I'm paying, whatever for a cup of coffee. To what extent do I have the capacity to know the conditions of the manufacturing of that styrofoam cup? It's just, we can't have perfect knowledge, perfect and full knowledge of these things. So that's where I'm sort of torn. Something, like Father Andrews, that's very clear in my mind. But I don't know that, as he said, the scale. I don't know that, that kind of solution is going to be able to provide all the goods and services that we need. So I don't know if I'm dodging your question or.
No.
Hi. So I have a question for Reverend O'Connor. In our ethical sourcing class with Professor Klimas, we're learning a lot about how sometimes it's hard to develop trust in a company because it's difficult to trace, where things might be sourced from if they're not certified fair trade or something like that. And I just was wondering, you said you get your yarn from Rhode Island, the one with the glass in it. Is that socially, does that follow the socially responsible model of your clothing as well? Like where the yarn is produced and things like that?
Well, thanks. I didn't actually go to the factory to find out if they're ethically produced in Rhode Island. It's the Louisiana of New England. It's kind of corrupt, but they're good. So I'm presuming actually that that's ethically produced there. The reason why I'm attracted to that company is that the actual fabric is it's 3M's Scotch-Brite. It's the same stuff that's used in your backpacks, and you see it appear in little. So it's a very expensive fabric that you only use a little bit of it. So that company in Rhode Island takes the Scotch-Brite, and then they have they just cut it. They have special ways to cut that fabric into a yarn. And so I use the yarn because of its tensile strength. Well, it looks good inside the cloth. So when they weave it into the cloth in Guatemala, and they can form the little crosses, and it looks good to me. And also, for them, they can verify that's why I'm using it. Is I can say they're only going to be using the wild cotton that I want them to use in the 1990s, when Guatemalan cloth had become very popular in the United States. The demand was so huge in Guatemala that to accommodate it, the Indians imported Chinese cotton that was very inferior, and then they produced a cheap product. So the competition among poor countries is predatory very often, and so regulating the amount of the high-tech fiber in it is how I'm monitoring that. I guess the 3M, and you'd have to go to Minneapolis, right, to go find out whether or not how 3M. It's a heavily patented fabric, the 3M Scotch-Brite. So they're a company that really knows how to cover all the bases and protect it. So they've done a good job in that. So that's enough for me to have confidence that maybe that's part of the model too, of saying where Professor Kelley was saying, look, you can't know the styrofoam cup at Dunkin' Donuts was produced well, but maybe there's something about there's an educated guess about 3M that although it's glass, just heat. Thanks.
I think we have time for one more question. Okay. Well, let's give our speakers another round of applause. And if I can make just a small pitch.